The oak-paneled courtroom of Cook County was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that usually preceded a shattered life. Brooklyn Taylor kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, her Quick-Mart uniform hidden beneath a cheap borrowed blazer, terrified of the man in the black robe who held her fate. But when the judge finally spoke, the cold, familiar baritone sent a violent tremor through her spine. She looked up, and staring back down at her was Logan Hayes, the husband she had betrayed, the man who had vanished without a trace 10 years ago. There are sins that time buries and sins that time puts on the bench to pass a sentence. If stories of buried secrets, lingering trauma, and the devastating cost of betrayal draw you in, stay with me. There is so much more unfolding behind these closed courtroom doors. The mahogany walls of courtroom 304 felt like the inside of a coffin. Brooklyn Taylor sat rigidly at the defense table, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were entirely white. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, indifferent hum, casting harsh shadows over the dark circles beneath her eyes. Inside her worn leather purse, resting near her scuffed boots, sat her blue Quick-Mart name tag, a bitter reminder of the graveyard shifts she had worked for the past 5 years, trying to scrape together a quiet, invisible life out of the ruins she had created. "Breathe, Brooklyn," Rachel Green murmured, not looking up from her yellow legal pad. The public defender was practically a blur of motion, highlighting statutes and shuffling papers. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Embezzlement over $50,000 is a Class 2 felony in Illinois. The prosecution has the paper trail from the store's vault. We need the judge to grant us bail while we dig into Chad Hunter's accounts, but—" Rachel finally looked up, her expression grim, adjusting her glasses. "Judge Hayes is notoriously ruthless. They don't call him the ice pick for nothing. He has zero tolerance for white-collar theft." Brooklyn nodded mechanically, swallowing the dry lump in her throat. She didn't care about the nickname. She just wanted to survive the morning. The very name Chad Hunter still tasted like bile in her mouth. 10 years ago, Chad had been a thrill, a wealthy, arrogant developer who promised her an escape while her husband was pulling double shifts at the law library. Now Chad was her landlord at the Quick-Mart Plaza and the cruel architect of her impending prison sentence. He had framed her a final brutal punishment for daring to cut him out of her life when the guilt became too suffocating to bear. "All rise!" the bailiff barked, his voice echoing sharply against the high acoustic ceilings. The heavy oak doors behind the bench swung open. Brooklyn stood up, her legs trembling slightly as she smoothed down the front of the cheap, borrowed blazer she wore over her plain black dress. She kept her eyes glued to the scuffed linoleum floor, bracing herself for the voice of the stranger who would twist it if she slept in a county jail cell tonight. The rustle of heavy fabric, the squeak of an expensive leather chair. A brief, heavy pause as the judge settled in and opened the manila case file. Case number 88-CR-1409. A deep, resonant baritone cut through the silence of the room. The state of Illinois versus Brooklyn Taylor. Brooklyn's breath hitched in her chest. It wasn't the formal legal phrasing that sent a violent shockwave through her nervous system. It was the timbre of the voice, the slight, almost imperceptible gravel on the vowels. It was a voice she had heard whispering in the dark of a cramped, poorly heated apartment a decade ago. It was a voice she hadn't heard since the night it had gone dead silent, right before the front door clicked shut forever. Slowly, entirely against her own will, Brooklyn lifted her head. Sitting behind the elevated mahogany bench, draped in the solemn, sweeping black robes of an American Circuit Court judge, was Logan Hayes. Time had aged him, sharpening the soft, exhausted lines of the struggling law student she once knew, into the hardened, imposing angles of a man who commanded absolute authority. There was a dusting of cold silver at his temples now, and his jaw was set like carved granite. For a fraction of a second, as Logan's eyes lifted from the paperwork, his gaze locked onto hers. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to plummet. In his dark, piercing eyes, Brooklyn saw the sudden violent flash of that winter night 10 years ago, the tangled bed sheets, Chad's panicked scrambling, her own hysterical weeping, and Logan's terrifying absolute silence as he packed his duffel bag and walked out of her life without a single word. He hadn't screamed, he hadn't fought, he had simply vanished. And now he was sitting up there looking down at her. Rachel stood up beside her, projecting a confident, practiced voice she clearly didn't feel. "Your Honor, Rachel Green for the defense. We humbly request—" "Ms. Green, Marcus," Logan interrupted. His voice was devastatingly calm, an Arctic chill devoid of a single ounce of recognition or warmth. He looked at Brooklyn not as the wife who had shattered his soul, but as an insect pinned beneath a microscope. The defendant is charged with systematic corporate theft. Let us skip the pleasantries. Brooklyn gripped the edge of the defense table to keep from collapsing to the floor. Logan had disappeared to escape her betrayal. Now the cruel machinery of fate had dragged her back to him, not for an apology, but for a sentencing. Court is in recess for 15 minutes. The gavel struck the wooden sound block with a sharp, hollow crack. Logan Hayes stood abruptly, his face an impenetrable mask of judicial indifference, and swept out of the courtroom before anyone could see the slight tremor in his hands. The heavy oak door of his private chambers clicked shut, its thick acoustic lining instantly severing the ambient murmur of the courthouse. Logan stood frozen in the center of the room. The oppressive silence rushed in to fill the space ringing in his ears. He reached up his fingers, gripping the collar of his black robe, and stripped it off as if the fabric had suddenly caught fire. He draped it carelessly over a leather armchair, his chest heaving beneath his crisp white shirt and conservative silk tie. 10 years. A decade of meticulously burying the past under law books, late-night case reviews, and the relentless pursuit of an unassailable reputation. They called him the ice pick. He was the man who never let emotion cloud the law. But as he walked over to his mahogany desk and stared down at the manila folder bearing the name Brooklyn Taylor, the ice cracked. He closed his eyes and he wasn't in downtown Chicago anymore. He was back in that freezing, radiator-hissing apartment in Hyde Park. He remembered the bone-deep exhaustion of a 14-hour day split between classes and waiting tables. He remembered turning his key in the lock, eager just to see her smile. And then the sensory assault that ruined his life, the unfamiliar, expensive scent of sandalwood cologne lingering in the hallway. The discarded leather jacket draped over the back of their cheap dining chair. The muffled sounds from the bedroom. He remembered pushing the door open, the tangle of sheets, the sudden horrifying stillness. Chad Hunter's pale, panicked face. But most of all, he remembered Brooklyn's eyes, wide terrified, pleading silently in the dim lamplight. Logan leaned his weight against the edge of his desk, gripping the wood until his knuckles ached. He had not yelled that night. He had felt something inside his chest snap with a violent finality, severing his vocal cords, his heart, his very capacity to feel warmth. He had packed his bag in absolute agonizing silence, while she wept on the floor begging him to say something. He had given her nothing. No closure, no anger. Just a ghost slipping out into the snow. Now that ghost wore a judge's robe. He opened the case file. The pages detailed a grim, pathetic reality. She wasn't living in the luxury she had chased. Her employment history listed 5 years of graveyard shifts at a Quick Mart. Her address was a dilapidated complex on the south side. And now she was facing a Class 2 felony accused of funneling $50,000 into a dummy account. Logan reached for the telephone. The Illinois Code of Judicial Conduct was explicitly clear. A judge must disqualify himself in any proceeding where his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. Being the ex-husband of the defendant was not a gray area. It was an immediate mandatory recusal. All he had to do was dial the administrative clerk, cite a personal conflict of interest, and the case would be reassigned before the 15-minute recess was over. His hand hovered over the receiver. The plastic was cool beneath his fingertips. He thought of her standing at the defense table wearing a blazer that didn't fit, trembling under the harsh fluorescent lights. He thought of the absolute godlike power he currently held over her freedom, her future, her very existence. He could save her or he could quietly, legally, utterly destroy her. Logan slowly pulled his hand away from the phone. The quiet tick of the grandfather clock in the corner was the only sound in the room as he sat down in his leather chair, pulled the file closer and began to read. The 15-minute recess felt like a death countdown. Brooklyn sat in a cramped, windowless consultation room just down the hall from courtroom 304. The air smelled of stale institutional coffee and floor wax. Across the scarred laminate table, Rachel Green was aggressively uncapping a cheap ballpoint pen, her focus entirely consumed by the stark arithmetic of the penal code. "Listen to me, Brooklyn. You need to focus," Rachel said, tapping the pen against a yellow legal pad. Her tone was sharp, devoid of sympathy, but heavy with a desperate kind of pragmatism. "I just caught the assistant district attorney in the hallway. They are offering a deal. 3 years in a minimum security facility if you plead guilty to a lesser charge of corporate fraud today. We bypassed the trial, we bypassed discovery. Brooklyn stared at the fluorescent light buzzing on the ceiling. 3 years. 36 months in a cell for Chad Hunter's crime. I didn't take the money, Rachel. I told you. Chad manipulated the Quickmart vendor invoices. He has the back-end access to the franchise accounts. I was just a shift manager. It doesn't matter what you were. It matters what the paper trail says, Rachel snapped, leaning forward. She lowered her voice, treating the walls as if they had ears. Do you understand who is sitting on that bench? Judge Hayes does not care about your theories regarding your landlord. He looks at ledgers. He looks at bank statements. The man is a machine. If we take this to trial and he finds you guilty, he won't give you 3 years. He will give you the maximum 7. He will make an example out of you. A hollow, agonizing laugh clawed at the back of Brooklyn's throat, but she swallowed it down. A machine. That was what the legal world thought of Logan. They didn't know the man who used to leave notes on the bathroom mirror, or the man who would spend his last $20 on a cheap bottle of wine for their anniversary. They only saw the cold, unyielding exterior that Brooklyn herself had forced him to build. He didn't recuse himself, her mind screamed. When the recess had been called, she had prayed with every fiber of her being that Logan would step down. It was the law. It was standard procedure. But the minutes were ticking by, and no clerk had come to announce a change of venue. Logan was keeping the case. He was keeping her. I can't plead guilty to something I didn't do, Brooklyn whispered, her voice trembling. He knows. He has to see that the evidence is circumstantial. He doesn't know you, Brooklyn. Rachel threw her hands up in frustration, the heavy silver bangles on her wrist clanking against the table. To him, you are just another desperate employee who got caught with her hand in the register. He has no reason to give you the benefit of the doubt. You are a stranger to him. The words struck Brooklyn like a physical blow. She looked at her attorney, the desperate urge to confess rising like bile. He isn't a stranger. He's my husband. He's the man I destroyed. And he is going to use this courtroom to bury me. But the shame was too thick a suffocating blanket over her chest. How could she explain that the Honorable Judge Hayes was the same man who had walked in on her naked with the very man now framing her for theft? How could she admit that she deserved whatever punishment Logan decided to hand down, not for the money but for the unforgivable betrayal of a decade ago? A heavy knock echoed against the door. Time's up. Counsel, the muffled voice of the bailiff called out. Judge Hayes is returning to the bench. Rachel hastily gathered her papers, shoving them into her battered leather briefcase. She looked at Brooklyn, her expression softening just a fraction. Last chance. Do I tell the ADA we're taking the plea, or are we going back in there to fight a war we can't win? Brooklyn stood up. Her legs felt like lead, her borrowed blazer suddenly heavy as armor. She thought of Chad's smug face. She thought of Logan's icy, unrecognizable eyes. We go back in, Brooklyn said, her voice barely a thread. No plea. The rhythmic drumming of an early Chicago rain against the cracked window of the public defender's office offered the only semblance of calm in the room. The space smelled of wet wool, cheap printer toner, and the bitter exhaustion of too many lost cases. Brooklyn sat rigidly in a plastic chair, her damp coat still wrapped tightly around her shoulders, while Rachel Green practically hovered over a glowing laptop screen. I knew the timeline didn't make sense, Rachel muttered, her finger tracing a line of dense green text on the screen. She hit a key, bringing up a side-by-side comparison of the Quickmart franchise ledgers. Look at this, Brooklyn. Look closely. Brooklyn leaned in the harsh blue light, washing over her pale face. She didn't understand the complex financial algorithms, but she could read the timestamps. The $50,000 hadn't vanished in a single duffel bag at the end of a shift. It had been systematically bled out in a series of digital wire transfers over a period of 3 months. Every single transfer happened between 2 and 4 in the morning. Rachel explained, her voice gaining a sharp, caffeinated edge. Your shifts. That's why the prosecution had built the narrative around you. But look at the authorization codes. You use a standard 4-digit employee PIN to access the register. These transfers were authorized using a Level A vendor master key. I don't have a master key. Brooklyn said, her voice hollow. Only the regional manager does. And the property owner. Exactly. And Rachel clicked another file, opening a corporate registry document. The plaza was bought out 2 years ago by a private holding firm, Hunter Commercial Real Estate. The CEO is Chad Hunter. Hearing the name spoken aloud in a legal context felt like a physical hand closing around Brooklyn's throat. She stared at the bold black letters on the screen. Chad Hunter, the arrogant, untouchable ghost of her past. When he had purchased the plaza and discovered her working the graveyard shift, sweeping floors, and counting loose change, he had found it endlessly amusing. He would come in after midnight, smelling of expensive bourbon and that same sickening sandalwood cologne, mocking her ruined life. When she finally found the courage to threaten to call the police for harassment, his amusement had turned into cold, venomous spite. He hadn't just framed her for the money. He had framed her to ensure she would never climb out of the gutter he had helped put her in. "This is our thread," Rachel said, pacing the narrow space between her desk and the filing cabinets. He had the access. He had the technical means. And if his holding company is struggling, he had the motive to create a phantom loss for an insurance write-off. "This is reasonable doubt, Brooklyn. It's thin, but it's real." Brooklyn's heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. "If we use this, what happens next?" "We file a motion to introduce alternate suspect theory," Rachel replied, entirely unaware of the absolute terror seizing her client. "We subpoena the back-end IP logs from Hunter's corporate office, and we put Chad Hunter on the witness stand." The room seemed to tilt. The rain against the glass sounded like static. "We put him on the stand," Brooklyn echoed the words, tasting like ash, "in front of Judge Hayes. Yes, we let Judge Hayes see exactly what kind of snake your landlord is." Brooklyn closed her eyes, fighting a sudden, violent wave of nausea. Rachel thought she was building a defense, but she was actually constructing a nightmare. The thought of Chad Hunter walking into courtroom 304 standing arrogantly under oath, while Logan Hayes sat high on the mahogany bench looking down at the man he had caught in his own marital bed. It was a collision of past and present that would shatter the very foundations of the courtroom. Logan had the power to destroy her legally, but if Chad took the stand, the trial would no longer be about corporate theft. It would become a silent, vicious war of unresolved sins, and Brooklyn would be the casualty caught in the crossfire. The penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan was completely silent, save for the faint, rhythmic ticking of a brass carriage clock on the mantel. Logan Hayes sat deep in the shadows of his study, the only illumination coming from a green glass banker's lamp that cast a harsh, concentrated pool of light across the mahogany desk. A crystal tumbler of expensive scotch, entirely untouched, sat sweating onto a leather coaster. Spread before him were the preliminary motions filed late that afternoon by Rachel Green. Logan's index finger slowly traced the stark black ink of the defense's primary argument. Hunter Commercial Real Estate. His finger stopped moving. He stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The name printed on the legal stock wasn't just a corporate entity. It was a ghost violently tearing through the meticulously built, impenetrable fortress of his mind. Chad Hunter. Logan closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his hands against his temples, as a dull, throbbing ache began to pulse behind his brow. For 10 years, he had operated under the agonizing assumption that Brooklyn had stayed with Chad, that they had built a lavish life on the ashes of his own laughing in their suburban comfort, while he crawled his way up from absolute nothingness. But the financial disclosures in the file told a different pathetic story. Brooklyn was a graveyard shift clerk with a negative bank balance. Chad was her predatory wealthy landlord. There had been no happy ending for the adulterers. Just a slow, ugly decay. He opened his eyes and looked back at the motion. Rachel Green was arguing that the digital footprints of the embezzled funds pointed to a vendor master key accessible only by the property holding company. It was a desperate, razor-thin defense, relying heavily on circumstantial EP logs and the arrogant sloppiness of a man who thought his wealth made him untouchable. Logan knew the law intimately. He knew the evidentiary standards required to grant a subpoena for corporate back-end records. The defense had met the absolute minimum threshold. A fair, impartial judge would sign the order dragging Chad Hunter into the unforgiving light of a courtroom to answer for the discrepancies. But Logan was not impartial. He picked up the heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen resting beside the file. The silver barrel was ice cold against his skin. If he denied the motion, citing a lack of direct compelling evidence linking the landlord to the store's internal vault, Brooklyn's defense would instantly collapse. The jury would convict. She would go to a state penitentiary for up to 7 years. The scales of cosmic justice, so brutally unbalanced 10 years ago, would finally be leveled. He could execute her not for the Quick-Mart money, but for the devastating betrayal that had hollowed out his soul. No one would ever know. It would just be another strict, unwavering ruling by the ice pick. His grip tightened on the pen until his knuckles turned white. The temptation was a physical heavy weight in his chest, dark and deeply intoxicating. He could still see her face in the courtroom from that morning, pale, terrified, utterly shattered, looking up at him like a condemned prisoner. Logan stared at the signature line on the order of denial. All it took was a single stroke of black ink to seal her fate and bury the past forever. He listened to the rain lashing violently against the floor-to-ceiling windows, sitting alone in the flawless, empty life he had built, suspended agonizingly between the wounded husband he used to be and the impartial judge he had sworn to become. The preliminary hearing for the defense's evidentiary motion was dragging into its second hour. Courtroom 304 felt devoid of oxygen. Rachel Green was at the podium, fiercely arguing the relevance of the IP logs, when her pager vibrated violently against her hip. She glanced down, her face paling slightly. "Your Honor," Rachel said, clearing her throat. "My office has just received the preliminary digital forensics report via courier, but I need to physically sign for it in the clerk's office downstairs. I humbly request a brief 5-minute pause." Logan sat perfectly still, his hands steepled over the manila folder. "Granted, Ms. Green. 5 minutes. The court will hold its place." Rachel nodded her thanks, grabbed her keycard, and hurried out. A moment later, the bailiff murmured something about getting coffee and slipped through the side door. Even the court reporter took the opportunity to step out into the hallway to stretch her fingers. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving the massive courtroom entirely empty, save for the judge on the bench and the defendant at the table. The silence that descended was absolute, heavy, and crushing. Brooklyn sat frozen, her hands clamped tightly together in her lap. Without the buffer of her attorney or the hum of legal proceedings, the physical distance between her and Logan felt violently intimate. She could hear the faint whisper of the air vents. She could hear the blood rushing in her own ears. She didn't want to look up. She swore to herself she wouldn't. But the oppressive weight of his gaze was a physical force pressing down on her shoulders. Slowly, her chin lifted. Logan was looking directly at her. The impenetrable mask of the ice pick had fractured just slightly. Gone was the impartial magistrate. In the dim ambient light of the quiet courtroom, Brooklyn saw the raw, unfiltered echo of the man who had stood in the doorway of their bedroom 10 years ago. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle feathered beneath his skin. His dark eyes were burning with a quiet, devastating question that needed no voice. Was it worth it? Was throwing away our entire life worth sitting in that chair? Brooklyn's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, a decade of desperate, weeping apologies rising in her throat, but the words died before they could form. What could she possibly say? "I'm sorry," was entirely insufficient for the murder of a marriage. Logan leaned forward, his forearms resting on the elevated mahogany edge. He didn't turn on his microphone. When he finally spoke, his baritone voice was barely above a whisper, echoing softly across the empty wooden pews. "Your counsel is taking a very dangerous gamble, Miss Taylor." Brooklyn's heart stopped. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her, stripping away the legal buffer of her attorney. It wasn't a judge addressing a defendant. It was a phantom addressing the living. "I didn't steal the money," Brooklyn whispered back, her voice shaking, breaking the dead air. She wasn't just defending her innocence against the felony. She was pleading to the husband she had wronged. I made terrible choices, unforgivable choices, but I am not a thief." Logan's expression hardened, the brief vulnerability instantly freezing over into something sharp and unforgiving. He looked at the cheap, frayed fabric of her collar, then back to her terrified eyes. "Actions have a way of catching up to us in the end." Logan said, every word meticulously chosen, dripping with the heavy venom of their shared past. "No matter how much time passes, or how easily we think we have escaped the consequences." The double meaning struck Brooklyn with the force of a physical blow. She lowered her head, hot tears finally spilling over her lashes and soaking into the lapels of her borrowed blazer. He wasn't talking about the Quickmart ledger. He was talking about the infidelity. He was telling her that this courtroom was her purgatory, and he was the executioner she had always deserved. "I know," Brooklyn choked out her voice, barely a broken breath. "I know I have to pay for what I did." The sound of the heavy oak doors creaking open at the back of the room shattered the moment. Rachel Green strode back down the aisle, clutching a thick sealed envelope, entirely oblivious to the suffocating, emotional wreckage she had just walked into. Logan instantly sat back, his face returning to carved granite as the judge's mask snapped flawlessly back into place. The heavy oak doors at the rear of courtroom 304 swung open, and the ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop. Chad Hunter walked down the center aisle with the effortless, predatory stride of a man who believed he owned the very floorboards he stepped on. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than Brooklyn had earned in a year at Quickmart. His hair was perfectly styled, his gold watch catching the harsh fluorescent light. As he passed the defense table, the faint, sickeningly familiar scent of expensive sandalwood cologne drifted through the air. Brooklyn's stomach violently recoiled. She dropped her gaze to the scarred wood of the table, her fingernails biting so deeply into her palms that they threatened to draw blood. "State your name for the record," the bailiff instructed as Chad stepped into the witness box. "Chadwick Hunter," he replied, his voice smooth and dripping with practiced ease. "CEO of Hunter Commercial Real Estate." The assistant district attorney, a sharp young man eager for a conviction, stepped up to the podium. "Mr. Hunter, thank you for appearing today. Can you describe your relationship with the Quickmart franchise in question?" "My firm acquired the plaza 2 years ago," Chad answered, leaning back slightly in the wooden chair, looking entirely unbothered by the gravity of a felony trial. "We manage the property, handle vendor logistics, and oversee back-end maintenance for the tenants." "And do you recognize the defendant sitting at that table?" Chad turned his head slowly. He looked at Brooklyn, at her pale, exhausted face. Her cheap, borrowed clothes and a microscopic, cruel smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "I do. Brooklyn Taylor. She was a night shift manager at the convenience store." He let out a soft, theatrical sigh of feigned sympathy. "A tragic situation, really. She always seemed very desperate, struggling to make ends meet. I suppose the temptation of an open vault and was simply too much for someone in her position." Rachel Green stiffened, half rising from her chair. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation and character assassination." Sustained, and a cold, dark baritone echoed from above. "The witness will stick to the facts." Chad blinked, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second at the sheer freezing command in the judge's voice. He turned his attention up to the bench, offering a deferential businessman-to-businessman nod. Logan Hayes did not nod back. He sat completely motionless, his dark eyes locked onto the man in the witness box. 10 years ago, Logan had been a gaunt, sleep-deprived kid in a faded hoodie, utterly shattered by the sight of this man in his bed. Now draped in the black robes of a circuit court judge with the silver at his temples and the hardened architecture of his jaw, Logan was entirely unrecognizable to the arrogant developer. Chad had absolutely no idea that the Honorable Judge Hayes was the ghost of the marriage he had ruined. Logan's heart rate was dangerously, methodically slow. The urge to lean over the mahogany bench to shatter the gavel over Chad's smug face was a living, breathing monster clawing at the inside of his ribs. But Logan was a master of cages. He kept the monster locked away, his face an impenetrable wall of ice. "Mr. Hunter, the AD, continued, oblivious to the silent, suffocating war in the room. "The defense alleges that a vendor master key accessible by your firm was used to initiate the fraudulent transfers. Is this possible?" Chad chuckled, a rich, condescending sound. "Absolutely not. Our back-end access is purely for structural maintenance. The financial ledgers are handled at the store level. If $50,000 vanished at 3 in the morning, it was the person standing next to the register who took it. Blaming a corporate landlord is just the desperate flailing of a guilty conscience." Brooklyn squeezed her eyes shut, a tear hot and stinging against her lashes. He was lying under oath, destroying her with the same casual cruelty he had used to discard her years ago. Up on the bench, Logan picked up his silver Mont Blanc pen. He uncapped it with a soft, precise click. Chad Hunter was willingly walking himself into a perjury trap, blinded by his own arrogance, completely unaware that the man holding the pen was the very man who was going to sign his execution warrant. The icy water rushing from the brass faucet of the courthouse restroom was the only sound grounding Brooklyn to reality. She braced both hands against the edge of the porcelain sink, her head bowed, gasping for air, as a violent, suffocating panic attack tore through her chest. Chad's smug voice, the sickening scent of sandalwood, and Logan's dark, hollow gaze had converged into a crushing weight, finally shattering the fragile composure she had maintained for 2 days. The heavy restroom door swung open, the hinges squealing loudly against the tiled walls. Rachel Green hurried in, her heels clicking rapidly across the linoleum. "Brooklyn, you cannot run out of the courtroom while the prosecution is submitting exhibits," Rachel snapped, though her sharp tone wavered with genuine concern as she took in her client's trembling frame. She dropped her heavy briefcase onto the counter. "I know Hunter's testimony was brutal. I know he is lying through his teeth, but I am filing a motion to compel his back-end server data. We just need to hold the line. The judge hasn't ruled yet." Brooklyn slowly lifted her head. The woman staring back at her in the harsh fluorescent-lit mirror was a ghost hollowed out by a decade of regret, her eyes red and spilling over with exhausted tears. "He isn't going to rule in our favor, Rachel," Brooklyn whispered, her voice cracking. She reached up with a wet, trembling hand and pushed the damp hair from her forehead. "It doesn't matter what evidence you find. He is going to send me to prison." Rachel frowned, pulling a tissue from her pocket and offering it. "I told you Judge Hayes is strict, but he is a slave to the law. If I can prove Hunter had the vendor key—" "You don't understand." Brooklyn's voice fractured into a desperate, broken sob that echoed sharply off the bathroom tiles. She turned away from the mirror, her back hitting the cold wall as she slid down slightly, the fight draining entirely out of her bones. "He isn't looking at a defendant. He isn't looking at the Quickmart ledgers. He is looking at the woman who ruined his life." Rachel froze, the tissue hovering in midair. The rapid calculating machinery of the defense attorney ground to a sudden halt. "What are you talking about, Brooklyn? You said you didn't know the judge." Brooklyn closed her eyes, the tears cutting hot, shameful tracks down her pale cheeks. The secret she had buried for a decade finally clawed its way out of her throat. 10 years ago, I was married. We lived in a terrible, freezing apartment in Hyde Park. He was working double shifts to pay for his law degree so we could have a better life, and I was lonely. She choked on the words, the memory of her own selfishness tasting like ash. "I slept with my landlord." Brooklyn continued, her voice dropping to a devastated whisper. "I slept with Chad Hunter, in our bed. And one night my husband came home early and caught us. He didn't say a word. He just packed a bag and walked out into the snow. I never saw him again. Not until yesterday morning when he walked up to that bench." Rachel's eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. The color drained completely from her face. She looked at the door, then back to Brooklyn, the catastrophic legal implications crashing down on her all at once. "Judge Hayes, is your ex-husband the man who caught you with the prosecution's star witness?" Brooklyn nodded slowly, letting her head rest back against the cold tile. "My God," Rachel breathed, her hands flying to her temples. "Brooklyn, this is a massive ethical violation. He is required by law to recuse himself. This is a mistrial. I have to go out there right now and file an immediate injunction to halt the proceedings. We are bringing this to the Judicial Review Board." As Rachel reached for her briefcase, Brooklyn lunged forward, her fingers wrapping desperately around her attorney's wrist. Her grip was startlingly strong. "No," Brooklyn pleaded, her eyes wide and frantic. "You can't. If you call a mistrial, it all becomes public. The board will investigate. His colleagues will know. You will drag his absolute worst humiliation out into the open and destroy the flawless career he built from nothing. Brooklyn, he is going to sentence you to a maximum security facility for a crime you did not commit," Rachel argued, trying to pull her arm away. "I know." Brooklyn sobbed, her grip tightening, her heart breaking all over again as she finally accepted the terrible gravity of her fate. "I didn't steal the money, but I am guilty, Rachel. I am so guilty. If this is the price I have to pay for what I did to him, then let him drop the gavel. The courthouse was a tomb by midnight. Outside, the Chicago wind howled through the concrete canyons of the Loop, rattling the reinforced glass of Judge Logan Hayes' chambers. Inside, the only light came from the harsh, sterile glow of his dual desktop monitors. Logan rubbed his eyes, the chronic fatigue of the past 3 days settling deep into his bones. His tie was loosened, his reading glasses pushed up into his graying hair. On the left screen was the transcript of Chad Hunter's smug, flawless testimony from that afternoon. On the right was the raw, unredacted back-end data from the Quick Mart franchise. Servers reluctantly surrendered by Hunter Commercial Real Estate after Rachel Green's desperate motion. The assistant district attorney had dismissed the digital logs as an incomprehensible wall of code, arguing it proved nothing beyond routine system maintenance. But Logan wasn't just a judge. He was a man who had spent his 20s surviving on black coffee and tax law textbooks, dissecting corporate fraud cases to keep the heat on in a miserable Hyde Park apartment. He knew how to read the spaces between the numbers. He scrolled down line by line, matching timestamps. 2:14 a.m. transfer $4,500. 3:02 a.m. transfer $6,000. Each transaction occurred during Brooklyn's graveyard shift. But Logan's eyes bypassed the time and locked onto the routing nodes. He pulled up Chad's sworn financial disclosure, the document where the arrogant developer stated under penalty of perjury that he had no direct access to the store's financial ledgers. Logan highlighted a string of IP addresses on the server log. He cross-referenced it with the proprietary network registry listed in Hunter's own corporate filings. The cursor stopped, blinking. Logan stopped, breathing. There it was, the smoking gun. The IP address used to authorize the phantom wire transfers didn't originate from the Quick Mart register on the south side. It originated from a secure private router in a penthouse suite in the Gold Coast, Chad Hunter's personal residence. Chad hadn't just used a vendor key. He had executed the embezzlement from his own living room while Brooklyn was physically mopping the floors miles away. Logan leaned back slowly, the leather chair groaning under his weight. The sheer magnitude of Chad's arrogance was staggering. The man had walked into Logan's courtroom, placed his hand on a Bible, and committed a Class 3 felony of perjury, entirely confident that the justice system was too archaic to catch his digital sleight of hand. Logan stared at the glowing screens. The power he held in this silent room was absolute and terrifying. If he closed the file right now and declared the defense's evidence inconclusive, Brooklyn would be convicted by Friday. She would lose everything. The cosmic debt of her infidelity would be paid in full, exacted by the very man she had betrayed. It was the flawless, untraceable vengeance he had spent a decade unconsciously craving. But if he let her burn, he would have to let Chad Hunter win. He would have to allow the man who had defiled his marriage bed to make a mockery of his courtroom. Logan stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dizzying grid of city lights. He thought of Brooklyn's hollow, terrified eyes. He thought of the heavy, broken way she held her shoulders at the defense table. She was no longer the selfish, reckless woman who had destroyed his youth. She was a casualty of the same monster who had left him with a hollow chest. She doesn't deserve my forgiveness, Logan thought, his reflection a pale, rigid ghost in the glass. But she doesn't deserve this. He turned back to the desk. He was the ice pick. He was the law incarnate. And no one, not even the ghost of his own ruined past, was going to commit perjury in his court. The morning air inside courtroom 304 was suffocatingly tense, thick with the unseasonable humidity of a Chicago rainstorm beating against the high windows. Chad Hunter sat in the witness box, exuding the bored impatience of a man whose time was vastly more valuable than the proceedings. Rachel Green stood at the podium, a sheen of nervous sweat on her forehead, as she attempted to walk the jury through the dense 50-page forensic server log. Mr. Hunter, according to this log, a vendor-level bypass was executed on the Quick Mart registry at 2:14 a.m., Rachel stated, pointing to a highlighted line on the projector screen. Can you explain this? Chad adjusted his silk tie, his smile patronizing. I am a real estate developer, Ms. Green, not an IT technician. As I stated yesterday, systems update automatically. A line of code does not equate to a physical person standing at a register stealing cash. The defendant was the only one in the building. The assistant district attorney stood up. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is badgering the witness with incomprehensible technical data. Up on the mahogany bench, Logan Hayes sat perfectly still. He had not slept. The bitter metallic taste of coffee and adrenaline coated his tongue. He looked down at the arrogant man who had haunted his nightmares for a decade. He looked over at Brooklyn, who was staring at her hands, bracing for the inevitable guilty verdict. Overruled, Logan's baritone voice cut through the room like a steel blade. Rachel opened her mouth to continue her line of questioning, but Logan raised a single authoritative hand, silencing the entire courtroom. "Ms. Green, if you please, I will examine the witness on this specific exhibit," Logan said. A ripple of surprise went through the jury box. It was highly unusual, though entirely legal, for a presiding judge to directly question a witness. Rachel stepped back, bewildered but compliant. Brooklyn's head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat as she looked at Logan. Logan did not look at her. He kept his dark, piercing eyes locked squarely on Chad. "Mr. Hunter," Logan began, his tone terrifyingly calm, devoid of a single ounce of heat. "You are under oath. You testified yesterday that neither you nor your executive staff manually accessed the store's financial ledgers. Is that correct?" Chad shifted slightly, the first microscopic crack appearing in his confident veneer. "Yes, Your Honor, that is correct." "The court directs your attention to page 42 of the submitted forensic log," Logan said, picking up his copy of the file. He read the numbers with surgical precision. Specifically the IP address listed under the unauthorized wire transfer. "Are you familiar with the numerical sequence 192.168.1.45? Chad swallowed. "I am not, Your Honor." "Allow me to assist," Logan continued, his voice dropping in volume, forcing everyone in the room to lean forward to hear the execution. "A standard subpoena to the internet service provider linked that specific IP address to a private, secure residential router. That router is registered to a penthouse suite in the Gold Coast, specifically your primary residence, Mr. Hunter." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The rhythmic drumming of the rain against the guy suddenly sounded deafening. Chad's arrogant smirk vanished entirely. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked up at the judge, desperately searching for an out, a legal loophole, a shred of mercy. He found nothing but an endless frozen abyss. "To be entirely clear for the record," Logan pressed, leaning forward just an inch, his eyes burning with a decade of buried silent rage that only Brooklyn could recognize. "The funds were not stolen from the physical register on the south side. They were electronically wired from a laptop inside your home while the defendant was miles away. You engineered a corporate theft, and then you sat in my courtroom, placed your hand on a Bible, and committed a Class 3 felony of perjury. I can explain." Chad stammered, his polished demeanor shattering into pathetic, desperate fragments. "There must be a mistake with the network." "There is no mistake, Mr. Hunter." Logan interrupted, his voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. He turned his gaze toward the prosecution table. "Counselor, in light of this irrefutable digital evidence, the court strongly suggests the state reevaluate its charges against Ms. Taylor and immediately open an investigation into the witness for grand larceny and perjury." Brooklyn gripped the edge of the defense table, tears of profound, overwhelming shock spilling over her lashes. Logan had not yelled. He had not exposed their broken past. He had simply used the sheer terrifying weight of the law to crush the man who had destroyed them both. Courtroom 304 emptied with the chaotic, buzzing energy of a freshly detonated bomb. Rachel Green was practically vibrating with adrenaline, wildly shoving case files into her leather briefcase while texting the public defender's office about the miraculous dismissal. But Brooklyn did not move. She sat frozen at the defense table, the deafening strike of the judge's gavel still echoing in the hollow cavity of her chest. Chad had been escorted out by 2 court officers, his arrogant facade reduced to a pale, stammering shell. The nightmare of the Quickmart ledger was over. She was a free woman. "Ms. Taylor," a low voice interrupted her paralysis. Brooklyn looked up. The bailiff was standing at the edge of the wooden partition, his expression carefully neutral. "Judge Hayes has requested your presence in his chambers. Just you." Rachel paused, her eyes darting between Brooklyn and the bailiff. But for once, the aggressive attorney said absolutely nothing. She simply gave Brooklyn a slow, solemn nod. The walk down the carpeted administrative hallway felt longer than a death march. Brooklyn's scuffed boots made no sound. When the bailiff opened the heavy mahogany door to the judge's private office and stepped aside, Brooklyn walked into the room, her lungs forgetting how to draw air. The door clicked shut behind her. The chambers were steeped in shadows, illuminated only by the gray, bruised light of the Chicago rainstorm filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Logan was standing with his back to her, looking out at the sprawling grid of the city. He had stripped off the black judicial robe. It lay discarded over the arm of a leather sofa, a physical shedding of the impenetrable ice-pick persona. He was just a man now wearing a wrinkled white dress shirt and a loosened silk tie. He looked unbearably tired. "You are officially cleared," Logan said, his deep voice devoid of the commanding, terrifying resonance it held in the courtroom. It was quiet, hollow. "The district attorney will formally withdraw the felony charges by 5 o'clock. You will have no record." Brooklyn stood near the door, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them tightly against her stomach. "Thank you, I know. I know what it cost you to do that." Logan finally turned around. The silver at his temples caught the dim light. He looked at her, truly looked at her, taking in the cheap blazer, the dark exhausted circles beneath her eyes, the fragile, shattered posture of the woman he had once sworn to love until his dying breath. "I didn't do it for you, Brooklyn." Logan said, his tone perfectly flat, though a microscopic tremor betrayed the agonizing weight behind his words. "I spent 10 years imagining this exact scenario. I wanted you ruined. When I saw you sitting at that defense table, terrified and powerless, I had the pen in my hand. I could have let you burn." A single tear spilled over Brooklyn's lashes, tracking hot and fast down her cheek. "Why didn't you?" "Because if I let a man like Chad Hunter use my courtroom to bury his sins, then I become exactly what you two are," Logan replied, the repressed venom finally bleeding into the quiet room. "I built my entire existence on the absolute sanctity of the law because it was the only thing I had left after you destroyed my life. I wasn't going to let him take that from me too." The brutal honesty of it dropped Brooklyn to her knees, not physically, but spiritually. The defensive walls she had built over the last decade crumbled into dust. "I'm sorry," Brooklyn whispered, as her voice breaking into a ragged, pathetic sob. The words she had screamed at an empty doorway 10 years ago finally found their target. "I am so incredibly sorry, Logan. For the apartment, for him. I was selfish and I was weak, and I threw away the only good thing I ever had. I have lived in hell every single day since you walked out." Logan stared at her weeping figure. For a terrifying second, Brooklyn thought he might step forward. She thought the ghost of the boy who used to kiss her forehead in the morning might reach out and offer her grace. Instead, Logan stepped back, placing both hands flat on the edge of his massive desk. The anger in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by an endless, suffocating emptiness that was infinitely worse. "Your hell was a choice, Brooklyn. Mine was a sentence." Logan's voice dropped to a heavy, devastating whisper. "The law says your debt to society is clear, but you and I both know that some debts can never be repaid." He looked away, his gaze returning to the rain lashing against the glass. "You have your freedom. Leave my courthouse, and do not ever put yourself in front of me again." The heavy brass and glass, revolving doors of the Daily Center pushed Brooklyn Taylor out into the biting Chicago afternoon. The rain had ceased, leaving the city pavement slick and gleaming like oil under the bruised purple clouds of twilight. She stood on the granite steps, her lungs burning as she took her first breath as a free woman. She felt light, yet impossibly heavy. Across the street, the neon signs of the Loop began to flicker to life. Brooklyn reached into her purse and felt the cold plastic of her Quick Mart name tag. With a slow, steady hand, she walked to a nearby trash receptacle and dropped it in. That life was over. The years of hiding in the shadows of graveyard shifts, punishing herself with a menial existence, had been culminated by this final brutal confrontation with the man she had broken. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb at the base of the courthouse steps. The tinted window slid down just an inch, and Brooklyn saw the sharp, unyielding profile of Logan Hayes. He didn't look toward her. He stared straight ahead at the gridlock of evening traffic. He looked like the very definition of American success, a powerful judge, a man of ironclad integrity, an untouchable figure of the law. But as the car pulled away, merging into the sea of red taillights, Brooklyn saw what the rest of the world missed. She saw the way his shoulders remained frozen, a rigid armor against a world that had once been too soft and too cruel. She had been cleared of embezzlement and messing, but Logan had sentenced himself to a lifetime of solitude behind those mahogany benches and penthouse windows. She began to walk. She didn't have a car, and she barely had enough money for the L train back to her cramped studio, but for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She passed a small, quiet park where the trees were beginning to bud with the first signs of spring. She thought about the Hyde Park apartment, the way the radiator hissed, the way Logan used to read his law books by the light of a single flickering lamp, and the way she had traded all that quiet, honest devotion for a flash of expensive sandalwood and a thrill that had turned to poison. She couldn't go back. There was no magic word, no legal motion, no apology deep enough to bridge the chasm of a decade. Brooklyn stopped at the entrance to the subway station. She looked up at the towering skyscrapers of the city, the monuments of glass and steel that Logan now belonged to. He had given her back her life, not out of love, but out of a desperate final need to be the man she wasn't honorable. She stepped onto the descending escalator, disappearing into the subterranean hum of the city. The trial was over. The records were sealed. Chad Hunter was headed for a cell, and Logan Hayes was headed back to his throne. As the train doors hissed shut and the carriage jolted forward into the dark tunnels, Brooklyn leaned her forehead against the cool glass. She was free, but she understood now that some cages don't have bars. They are built of the things we didn't value until they were sworn and the people we can never again look in the eye. The city moved on indifferent to the two ghosts who had briefly collided in courtroom 304, leaving them both to navigate the long, cold walk toward whatever came next.